Could I also say a quick welcome to Wendy, who's one of our newer members,
Yeah, absolutely.
who I
Welcome, Wendy.
don't recognize by face, but hopefully we'll be able to actually physically meet soon.
Right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That's wonderful. And we have, of course, Bill and Edie. Edie's a past president sitting back there. Good to see them both. Edie's our Kabbalah expert, as well as many other things.
We got a lot of past presidents here, Mark. You know?
We just have another one just came on. The Atkins have come on. Founders of the temple.
You got Amy and I and
Well, Amy, absolutely. Absolutely.
too many. The past presidents are pervasive in the temple.
Forever. And I think Amy's just the only thing is we don't pay Amy. That's it. But Amy's such a integral part of the temple. My gosh, it's like a fourth rabbi.
No rabbi.
Well, Rabbi Zub just came on, so he's our founding rabbi, of course, and still our rabbi, along with the Rabbi Michaels.
You know, Mark, do you remember we had a lecture? As foreign resident, I don't know how many, it was years ago. There was a very famous guy, Christian, I can't remember his last name, but he was at the Harvard School of Divinity. He was an expert on Jewish-Christian relations in the early days of Jesus, and that post-Jesus.
I think Kristen Stendhal, probably.
Kristen Stendhal.
Kristen, yeah.
Yeah. Talked about the Essenes and the Pharisees.
One of the saints of this world in many ways.
Okay, let me just mention now it is 9:30, as Avi is so good at keeping us on time.
It's 9:32.
9:32.
So we can start.
Okay. One thing so people know we are being recorded, just so you know there is going to be a recording, so we're live.
And don't forget to mute yourselves.
Right, or I will mute you.
As best you can. Okay, so who is Ruth Langer? And how did she become recognized as an authority on Jewish liturgy and Jewish Christian relations, among other things? And remember, today's subject is Jewish Christian relations in an age of dialogue. So maybe we could ask Ruth today, what's a Jewish rabbi PhD doing at Boston College, a university whose identity is clearly Jesuit, Catholic, Christian, and whose non-Christians participants there could be possibly viewed as welcome guests or even outsiders. And here's a bit about how that happened. So, would you believe 40 years ago, she graduated summa cum laude from Bryn Mawr College with a major in history of religion and a concentration in Jewish studies. That's 1981. In 1986, at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, she became an ordained rabbi. It's in 1986. 1990, she earned a Master's of Philosophy in Hebraic and Cognate Studies. And finally, in 1994, she became a PhD in Jewish liturgy. Her Master's and PhD were at Hebrew Union College. And somewhere between 1986 and 1994, she had a son and a daughter. And she's married to Jonathan Sarda, who is a professor at Brandeis. And her teaching in the theology department, comparative theology area at Boston College, began in 1995 and continues to this day. In 2012, she was finally appointed a professor, no longer assistant or an associate. And that's how she got to where she is at the moment, in omitting many details. There are 5 books that her name is on, 2 of which she's co-editor of. And her latest book was just published this year, and it's called Enabling Dialogue About the Land, a resource book for Jews and Christians to help them discuss and understand the issues between Israeli-Palestinian disagreements. That's her latest book. She's a co-editor with 2 other people. And it's a result of of an International Conference of Christian and Jews. I never heard of this organization. I don't know how many of you have heard of this organization. It has been around since 1946 or 47 at least. And anyway, I find she's just, her interests are anyway, engaging, I would say. She has listed four interests that I find fascinating. She's interested in prayer and Jewish identity, how Jewish liturgy and identity interact, particularly with regard to the non-Jewish world. She's interested in theologies of Israel in Jewish-Christian relations. She's trying to put together a book-length history of early rabbinic liturgy, and also a study of how memory functions in Jewish ritual liturgic life. These are really big issues. And besides doing all these things, teaching and writing, she's the interim director for the Center of Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. And she was chair for 6 years. She's the past chair of another Jewish organization whose name I get confused because they're so long. Another Jewish Christian organization, which I never heard of before. So anyway, I think we now have the basis for appreciating her commitments to scholarship, teaching, and improving the world. And I am grateful and excited to give you Rabbi Dr. Ruth Langer.
Thank you very much, Mark and Mark. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to have a sort of more formal PowerPoint lecture that I hope will last no more than about 45 minutes. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, which I will not be looking at while I'm speaking because I can't handle all these different pieces. Or you can save them and we'll be able to have some live discussion at the end. That's my goal with all of this. So with that, let me share my screen and start, and also just say how much I appreciate the chance to actually have live interaction with people above the age of 22. Actually, I do have graduate students also, but this is a dimension of life that's been challenged and missing for me in the last months, the last year at this point, and very much appreciate this chance to engage with a different community of people than I usually see. So let me get this to. Okay, so where are we today when we start talking about Jewish-Christian relations? On the one hand, January 27th is International Holocaust Memorial Day and is going to be the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And I think that's very much part of our context for this moment. We're also living in a world of public and violent insurrection by white supremacists, some or many of whom espouse Holocaust denial. I show you have a picture here of the man who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th wearing a Camp Auschwitz hoodie, and on the back it said staff. So he was imagining himself as a Nazi. Others not seen at the Capitol so much, but in other groups of these folks, the designation 6MWE, 6 million was not enough, or 88 for HH, the 8th letter of the English alphabet, Heil Hitler. So this is a world in which neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism has bubbled up to the surface in a multitude of forms. And this is coming as the public face of something that we've been seeing intensifying in recent years, the public employment of anti-Semitic motifs. This is an ad that was run in July by Purdue against John Ossoff in their initial campaign for the Senate. And Ossoff's nose was extended somewhat beyond his regular visage, which is a classic anti-Semitic motif, but also the very fact that he's put in a picture with Chuck Schumer, also a Jew. Democrats are trying to buy Georgia. This is a hint of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the threat of Jewish domination of the world. We could also look to a meme that went around last spring, where you have a stereotypically anti-Semitic image of a Jew with giving a shot, but this isn't a vaccine. This is at the beginning of the virus. Get your coronavirus shot. And there was a theme that was making the rounds. The Jews were responsible for the COVID situation. And then we can add to this attacks on synagogues that were happening more before everything closed down, because what's the point of attacking an empty building, although there's still been some graffiti. But we can think of Pittsburgh, we can think of Poway, we can think of Halle in Germany. And then in 2015, though, in counterbalance to this, we had the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, which was a seminal document of the Second Vatican Council that really started a process of revolutionizing Catholic-Jewish relations. So we're in a situation right now where the world is feeling very scary on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is a lot of good stuff that's going on. And what I want to do is balance that scary reality in which we are sitting, in which we are living, with talking about what the foundations are of the repair of that kind of reality that's been happening. I can share later that there was a good, really excellent lecture given by my husband, granted on my invitation, but it's on YouTube and available now, about these anti-Semitic themes that are going on right now. So the title was White Supremacy and Anti-Semitism, Lessons from the Capitol Attack. And this is a lecture that he gave a week and a half ago. So we are dealing in a world in which some complexities are lingering, and the Kulturkampf, the culture wars that are existing in our world, are calling up some of the anti-Semitic reflexes that still exist in our society. But there's a feeling of the white heterosexual Christian norm being threatened as the dominant form of American life. And it's being threatened by other religions, by other races. And so there's a pushback against that that's going on right now in our world. And this is something that becomes a struggle for us, not just because anti-Semitism affects us directly, but because many of us have really thought of ourselves as white and have struggled to be white in our society, even though our Jewish world is not entirely white, but we're unsure of where we fit in. We have all these different things popping up in our world, and we want to be allies, or I do, with Black Lives Matter and the calls for racial justice, diversity. We are pulled between the things having to do with Israel, the calls for Palestinian rights that lead to the extreme of Zionism is racism. But the opposite of that is Christian Zionism, which doesn't necessarily support the long-term health of Israel, anti-Islam, Christian America as opposed to a diverse America, and white supremacy at another extreme. And in this, the pull between American freedoms and strong government. And in all this, I couldn't even figure out where to put a little human to represent myself, because many of these themes are pulling me in different directions. And my guess is the same thing is true for many of you as well. Now, I'm not a contemporary historian, and I don't want to do more than just name these categories, put them on the table. I'm sure you're all aware of them too. But what I'd like to do today is to give background that is going to help us understand today's moment and the potential for healing that comes from the revolutionary changes in Jewish-Christian relations in the past decades. So I'm going to go back in time. Christianity emerged now almost 2,100 years ago into a Jewish world that was suffering and chaotic because of the ravages of Roman rule, especially over taxation. And this is a world in where Jews were hoping for divine intervention in the form of a Messiah who would come and free them from Rome and begin the era envisioned by the prophets of self-rule, peace, prosperity, where each one of them would dwell under his vine and under his fig tree, and none would make them afraid, where they would beat their spears into pruning hooks and their swords into plowshares. These are prophetic agricultural images. I have troubles getting my students to relate to the agricultural imagery, but maybe you all can do better. But they're images of peace. And interestingly, these images were images that both Biden and Amanda Gorman alluded to in their Biden's speech, Gorman's poem at the inauguration on Wednesday. Jesus's followers, though, recognized different and non-political messianic qualities in him. Political qualities were very dangerous. And they quickly came to understand that these other prophetic visions would be what would be fulfilled in his, or this list would be fulfilled in the future in his second coming, not in the immediate times. So Christians didn't claim that Jesus had achieved these hopes, and they placed their emphasis instead on interpretations of his sacrificial death and resurrection as something that freed humanity from their sins, that enabled a solution to suffering after death. And only with his return, with his second coming, would earthly existence be transformed too, only then fulfilling the visions of peace and prosperity. The Gospels, however, retain hints of Jewish messianic understandings. The Gospel of Matthew begins, and Luke has, shortly after the beginning, a genealogy which links Jesus to King David, who has to be the progenitor of the Messiah in classic Jewish thinking. Or the Romans placed the label King of the Jews on the cross, according to the Gospels, also indicating these political aspirations and associations with the Messiah. Now, what happens very quickly within Christianity is that Christianity is taken to the Gentile world, and Jesus' followers emerge who are not Jews and become dominant in the movement. This leads Christianity to reject and forget its Jewish roots. And so for most of Christian history, Jews are other. Jews are people who rejected Jesus. They claim that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed as punishment for this rejection of Jesus. And the New Testament itself is shaped by these tensions with Jews, and therefore filled with polemical language against Jews. That polemical language was not as harsh and strange in the Roman world as it sounds to later generations, when polemics are not really acceptable ways of speaking about others. In Roman times, this was a way of communicating passion, but people knew to discount it. But later generations didn't know to discount it. And as a result, Jews came to be understood not as Jesus's family and friends, which historically they were, but as the villains of the story who persecuted and ultimately called for Jesus's crucifixion. And so this image then was extended to local contemporary Jews throughout most of Christian history. As Jews, as people who were continually acting on a hatred of Jesus. So a series of teachings emerge within about 150 years of Jesus's crucifixion that shape Christian attitudes to Jews and Judaism until the Holocaust and beyond, when we will have a revolution. And these are that Jews fail to understand their own Bible. They misinterpret what's in their own scriptures. Jews are eternally and collectively guilty for murdering Christ. This is known as deicide, murdering God. And that God punished the Jews by destroying the temple and exiling the Jews from Jerusalem, sentencing them to wander eternally. And therefore, it was understood as being incorrect for Jews to return to their homeland in the biblical land of Israel. Now, I'm going to oversimplify and move relatively quickly to the present, but this dynamic shaped deepening suspicions about Jews in medieval Europe, that Jews sought to crucify Jesus again by desecrating consecrated hosts. That's what you see on the right-hand side of this picture. And all these people with circles, that's how they were marked as Jews. That Jews killed Christian children. And so here are depictions of what's known as the ritual murder of a boy named William of Norwich, who died in 1144, but was understood then to be a saint by the church, and the Jews killed him in order to re-crucify Christ. That when Jews did that, they were interested in many cases in using the blood of these children to make matzah, which is a very, very common trope in popular Christian anti-Semitism. But there are also more racialized forms of anti-Semitism that emerged in the Christian world. So you see on the left here a picture, a plaque which is way up high in the cathedral in Wittenberg. It was put there in 1305, but over 200 years later, Martin Luther preached in Wittenberg and made reference to this, which is the source of the depiction of it, the drawing of this, on the right-hand side of your screen. And what do you see here? You see what's known as the Judensau, the Jewish sow, S-O-W, the female pig. And what is going on is you have a series of Jews, you can see in the engraving better, marked by the circles on them, that are suckling from the sow's teats, and one in this case looking intently at the sow's anus. And we'll see shortly that that one is not always so benign. This image of Jews as evil, you see quite clearly here from a 19th century depiction, where you see the large nose, very much like we saw in that picture early on that was used this year. And on the back of this rich Jew, signaled as rich not only by the size of his belly, but by his huge money bags, you see a devil. So this association of Jews with the devil is something that is appearing still in the 19th century, but we can see it, let me go back to this picture, we can see it clearly also in these earlier pictures. What's on the top of this picture is a depiction of Simon of Trent, who is one of the children classically understood to have been murdered by Jews for the use of his blood at Passover. And some of the most famous depiction of this, the drawing of the blood is shown as a act of circumcision also. But here you can see the devil, you can see that the Jews riding the Judensau backwards. You have a woman on a goat in the back also. All of these animals are defecating right into the mouths of Jews. And we can see that the Jews on the bottom here are being depicted as savages also, in that they are essentially naked. But the person on the left grinning on is again clearly a devil figure. So these are images which just show up all over the place in the medieval and the modern worlds. And then they are surfacing in white supremacist anti-Semitism again today. This racial anti-Semitism is more directly responsible for leading to the Holocaust. That's, again, a whole lecture, which we're not going to get into today. I'm more interested in getting to the question of how did this change? And what can we turn to and nurture in today's world in order to keep these history and not part of our present reality? That's the important question. So how did it begin to change? In the 1700s, Enlightenment thinking opened the door to recognizing that all humans were human. And so no matter what their religion was, no matter what their skin color was, there was a common humanity that ought to be recognized and celebrated. Now, this, of course, is something that an ideal that was never completed. Some people still have difficulty extending this idea to non-Caucasians and to Jews, but the idea allowed Europeans to begin contemplating granting Jews citizenship. And the first place in the world to grant Jews citizenship was here in the United States under the United States Constitution. Not complete until significantly into the 19th century on a state-by-state basis, but the United States Constitution granted equal rights to independent of one's religion, and that then included Jews. In Europe, citizenship happened as Napoleon conquered one country after another. So we're into the first decade of the 19th century. He freed the Jews, he emancipated the Jews, gave them citizenship, and none of that actually ever reverted. Granted citizenship then, Western Jews especially sought full acceptance, or fuller acceptance maybe more accurately, only to be increasingly rebuffed as racial anti-Semitism reemerged and strengthened. So while there were glimmerings of Christian reconciliation with Jews, and certainly there were Jews who were able to be successful contributors to society, in business, in government, in the military even, in civil service, in the intellectual world, at the level of religious teachings, and in many hearts, there was still little change. So radical change only came in the wake of Christian confrontation with the complicity of their teachings in the Shoah. While various statements were issued against anti-Semitism in the immediate wake of the war, there was an important meeting of Jewish and Christian educators in Salisbury, Switzerland in 1947, and this is the initial meeting of what becomes the International Council of Christians and Jews that Mark Beale referenced. And this meeting called for deeper changes than just denouncing anti-Semitism. It made concrete suggestions about what people ought to do, particularly in the realm of education. But substantive inner reform really began with the Second Vatican Council. It was a gathering of all Catholic bishops globally with the overall goal of bringing the church into the modern world. It was called in 1959 by Pope John the 23rd. And we should note that in Catholic understanding, God, through the Holy Spirit, guides the deliberations of such a council. So anything that comes out of this council and a decision which is voted upon holds the highest authority of any teaching in the Catholic Church, higher even than something that the Pope himself decrees with authority. So although Pope John the 23rd was alert to Christian anti-Judaism, he'd been involved in helping with Jewish refugees in Turkey during the Second World War. And he went immediately after he became Pope, the first Easter season, he removed insulting language about the Jews from the Good Friday prayers before starting to lead those prayers. But in spite of these things in his personality, relations with the Jews was not on the original agenda of the council. But that's something that changed when a man named Jules Isaac, a French survivor and a respected historian, approached the Pope in 1960 with a catalog of what he called the Christian teaching of contempt. And this galvanized the Pope to call on Cardinal Augustin Bea, German, to draft a declaration about the Jews for consideration by the council. Now, Cardinal Bea consulted with both Catholics and Jews to develop the content of the declaration. In other words, then, dialogue was built into the process of coming up with what the Catholic Church needed to do to revise its teachings and to address its teachings. So his gatherings included several consultations with the American Jewish Committee, which had done extensive studies on the teachings about Jews in Catholic textbooks. Also, he met with leading rabbis. So prior to the first session of the council in 1962, based on this, Cardinal Bea submitted a statement on the Jews, but it was removed from the agenda of the council because conservative Catholic and Arabs were objecting. So this led to Cardinal Bea traveling to the United States for further dialogic consultations, most notably here in Boston with Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who soon backed out over objections to theological dialogue, but quite extensively and importantly, not in Boston, with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who understood his contributions as an explicit answer to the call of the Holocaust, in which he had lost huge numbers of his own family. While in Boston, Cardinal Bea also learned a lot from Cardinal Cushing, the local cardinal, whose role drawing on long-standing interactions with local Jews should not be ignored at all. So Heschel's advice included the following points. First, that the church should reject the deicide charge that Jews were eternally responsible for murdering God in the crucifixion of Jesus. And also this implied in this is the understanding that Jews were eager and willing continually to repeat that act. That the church should recognize Jews as Jews and not as potential converts. That the church should create more knowledge and understanding through education of priests and theologians, joint study, civic and charitable cooperation. That it should explicitly reject anti-Semitism, and that the Vatican should establish a permanent high-level commission, both at the Vatican and locally, that would be dealing with Christian-Jewish relations. At the Vatican, this certainly still exists. More locally, it's been more challenged. Now, Cardinal Bea had to obviate opposition to this document. And so in 1963, it was attached to a larger statement on Christian relations with other religions in general. And even so, it aroused objections primarily from bishops in Muslim lands. I think it's important to understand that objection. Of course, the State of Israel was established in 1948, so it existed, but was still 17 years old at the close of the council, at this point, even less. All the Muslim countries were in a state of war with Israel, and bishops coming from those countries feared that Catholic acceptance of Israel at the Vatican level, i.e. internationally, would undermine the health and safety of Christians living in the Arab world. And I think we can appreciate this because Christian communities of those countries have indeed been persecuted and have dwindled radically in the subsequent decades. Now, most famous in the tortuous process of revisions was Heschel's further intervention. A 1964 draft, not written by Bea, added a call for Jewish conversion to Christianity. Heschel was incensed by this, and he flew to Rome on the eve of Yom Kippur, demanded a meeting with the Pope, and condemned this as what he called spiritual fratricide. And he famously stated, "I am ready to go to Auschwitz at any time if faced with the alternative of conversion or death." To us, this may not be shocking, but to the Catholic world, it was absolutely shocking. And this draft was withdrawn from the council. Only after more revisions, the document now named Nostra Aetate was overwhelmingly approved in October 1965. The declaration's title comes from its first words in Latin, which is typical of Catholic documents. And these words mean in our time, so they don't tell us a whole lot. But the English title is the Declaration on the Relationship of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. And I want to spend some time on this document, on this declaration, because it's what set the terms not only of Catholic, but also of much of Christian-Jewish dialogue. It was widely used as a guidepost by other churches, mostly mainline Protestants, that were open to similar moves. And so you see here the topics of its 5 paragraphs, only the 4th of which, about Judaism, was really well developed. This is not only because the original kernel of the declaration was the paragraph about Judaism, but it's also due to Jewish interest and involvement in the process, combined with the fact that Christianity, of course, was born from Judaism, and so always needs to be relating back to Judaism of the Bible, Judaism of the time of Jesus. Christians cannot tell their own story without referencing Jews. So theologically and historically, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is just closer than between Christianity and any other religion. So what does Nostra Aetate teach? To appreciate its teachings about Judaism, we're just going to glance very, very quickly at some elements of its language about other religions. I tried to summarize them in this table. So if we note just by length, Hinduism and Buddhism together get 373 words, and this is in English. Islam gets 179, so about half. So they each get about 180 words. Judaism gets 674 words. So much greater depth and development of the discussion. About Hinduism and Buddhism, the language that's used is that they have a certain awareness of a hidden power. They reflect a ray of truth. So there's a very veiled possibility that there's something right about those religions and their teachings, and that the church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in them, but of course only accepts what is true and holy and doesn't assume that everything else is true and holy about their teachings. About Islam, the document says that the church has high regard, but why? Because of its worship of God, because it accepts Jesus and Mary as saints, and because it has the proper moral teachings. So that's more substantive. But it doesn't actually affirm Islam. The parallel, as close as it gets to a parallel to the statement about what's true about Islam, is actually quite different. It's a call to forget the past and seek understanding. So it's a political statement, the reality that the political boundary between Christianity and Islam was a site of enormous numbers of wars over history. And it's saying, let's move past that. So we get to paragraph 4, and it begins with amazing language in contrast to these other two. It calls on the church to remember the spiritual ties linking Christians with the stock of Abraham. So Jews are recognized as descendants of biblical Jews. And there are spiritual ties, not just economic ties or political ties, but spiritual ties linking these two communities. And these are concretized in the fact that the Christian Old Testament comes from the Jews, it's being recognized, and that Jews, it's hinted at in Nostra Aetate, developed more later, that Jews are recognized as being in covenant with God. That's quite different, and we'll come back to that, than the previous teachings about Jews and Judaism. And there are complex statements in the remainder of these 674 words trying to deal with the heritage of anti-Judaism. So that's not racial anti-Semitism so much, although it condemns anti-Semitism, but Christian theological anti-Jewish statements. So I just didn't want to spend time reading the whole document, so that's the summary. And here's a summary then of the specific points of paragraph 4. So it makes essentially 4 important theological points. The one we talked about, that Christians have enduring spiritual ties to Jews. It makes the point that Jesus, Mary, and the apostles were Jews. Now, you might say, well, of course. But the reality is that Christians had forgotten this. And so this was a radical statement to say, no, Jews is not a negative category that we apply to people who are other. Our most revered founding figures were Jews, and in Christian understanding, God was incarnate in the body of a Jew. And so in order to understand our own roots, we need to understand Judaism. And this is radically changing attitudes. Also, that God continues to hold Jews dear and is true to God's promises with Jews and to Jews, that Jews are in enduring relationship with God, that God understands as a positive relationship, and therefore Christians should too. And in terms of the deicide charge, that no Jews today are responsible for the death of Jesus. The document actually says that only some Jews then were responsible, right? So the Bible, that gospel narrative says that Jews were involved, but it was only certain individuals then, and certainly not all Jews for all time. The document also then makes a series of practical calls to take these theological points and try to make them real. So it requires that Catholic education and teaching present an accurate theology about Jews. The ways that Christians have historically read the Bible may no longer be the way that people preach and teach. This has actually been quite challenging to implement, but it is one of the requirements here. It calls anti-Semitism a sin in all forms, and it suggests that Christians should be in dialogue with Jews, seeking mutual respect through discussions, through study together, in order to de-other the Jews in many ways, and to make the common humanity come through and come to recognize and understand differences. So these are all very positive and very important, but there's a lot that's not here. And that's what we really need to look at. So Jews, we like to criticize. It's very much in our blood to immediately, so we listen to something, we start, instead of saying what's right about it, we try to figure out what's wrong with it. And we understand that internally as a mode of existence. We don't take it too seriously. One of the things I learned very soon in my time at Boston College was that that's not the way the Catholic world works. You're expected to come in and praise and find what's right, and then very gradually, very carefully come up with criticisms. But that's not the way the Jewish world works, and it's not the way the Jewish world worked in its public responses to Nostra Aetate and also later documents. And Jews did not come up with any kind of equivalent statements about Christianity until the first one was a document that was eventually signed by 200 some rabbis in the United States called Dabru Emet in the year 2000, overshadowed almost immediately by a much more problematic.
Wikipedia has this result.
My phone just heard me say something that made it give me some answer to some question. In the year 2000, a Catholic document called Dominus Jesus, saying that salvation is only through Christ, came out about a week later than Dabru Emet and got all the press and all the energy. So this document didn't do that as much as they had hoped. And then in 2015, for the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, there were 2 Orthodox rabbinic statements that came out. That's about it in terms of really carefully drafted Jewish statements about Christianity. So what were the criticisms? What was missing? So first of all, the denunciation of the deicide charge is not as explicit as it could have been. The word deicide does not appear in Nostra Aetate. The denunciation of anti-Semitism was actually toned down. The original drafts had the word deplores, and they ended up with decries because people are objecting to this denunciation. There was not an admission of Christian responsibility for the Holocaust in the document itself. And this is something which was addressed subsequently, sort of. So in 1998, took a long time, from 1965 to 1998, it's 33 years. The Vatican finally came out with a document that was an explicit denunciation of the Holocaust, sort of, called We Remember. And what this document does is it voices remorse for the actions of the sons and daughters of the church. So it doesn't speak to Catholic responsibility, but it says we're sorry for the actions of the sons and daughters of the church, and it calls for widespread Holocaust education. In the year 2000, so very shortly after this, Pope John Paul made his first and only pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And unlike his predecessor, Paul VI, who had also gone to the Holy Land, but had not gone into Israel proper except for barely, John Paul went, and you probably remember this, prayed at the Western Wall in a hugely symbolic action. And he not only prayed at the Western Wall, he prayed in Jewish fashion, putting the text of his prayer on a piece of paper and putting it in a nicely cleared out large crevice in the wall. But this is the text of his prayer. And he says, God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours to suffer. And asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant. So this also does not say, God, I'm sorry for everything the Catholic Church did to cause the Holocaust, because the Catholic Church cannot do that. The Church itself is understood to be the mystical embodiment of Christ, and therefore cannot itself sin. That's Catholic theology. But the people who are members of the church can and do sin. And so therefore it talks about the behavior of those who caused Jews to suffer. And he's talking not just about the Holocaust, but about the whole 2,000-year history of, or not quite 2,000 years, but close to 2,000-year history of Christian persecutions of Jews. So asks for God's forgiveness and commits the church going forward to genuine brotherhood with people of the covenant. So people of the covenant then, as a term for Jews, is also not insignificant. So this has been answered in some ways. The lack of reference to the Holocaust in Nostra Aetate, even though the Holocaust was very much the catalyst that led to Nostra Aetate. What else was missing? Most important to Jews, there was no mention of Israel, of the state of Israel, or the return of Jews to Israel, of Zionism. And in 1985, a document that came out from the Pontifical Council for Religious Relations with the Jews specifically said that it was the first document that mentions the state of Israel, and it called it part of the contemporary Jewish political reality, but said that Catholics need not ascribe theological importance to the land, leaving the door wide open for essentially not admitting Jewish relationship with the land, and has caused room for lots more ink to be spilled. But this political reality led in 1992-93 to the fundamental agreement between the Israel as a state and the Vatican as a political state. And that fundamental agreement still stands, is still not totally implemented, at least as far as the Vatican is concerned, but it's there. So that's been also addressed in many ways. Another lack was it didn't legitimize any post-biblical rabbinic traditions or forms of living Judaism. Now, part of this is because it was too complicated. Part of it is because not enough participants in the council knew any Jews. And so they had no conception of what they were really talking about. But that Nostra Aetate can be read as referring only to Jews of Jesus's time and prior to that, which is a problem. So in 1974, the first document that came out of the Vatican for implementation of Nostra Aetate, it's drawing on an American bishop's document, a French bishop's document, I believe some German bishop's documents also. So there had been local work prior to this. It's the 1974 guidelines, I should be having say on the practical level in particular, Christians must therefore strive to acquire a better knowledge of the basic components of the religious tradition of Judaism. And this is the key line. They must strive to learn by what essential traits Jews define themselves in the light of their own religious experience. So Christianity could not be what Judaism could not be what Christians imagine it should be, but rather Judaism has to be what Jews understand it to be. A Judaism as described by a Christian has to be something that a Jew would recognize. And that becomes a fundamental requirement of dialogue, that I need to strive that my understanding of the other is an understanding that the other says, yeah, you got it right. And that makes a big, big difference. Another challenge, and this is the final one that I want to raise, of things that were not recognized at the period of Nostra Aetate, and which this one in this case is really embedded as a problem within Nostra Aetate, is a recognition of the challenges that Christian mission causes for Jews. In order to get Nostra Aetate passed, and it was passed by this huge margin, it needed to embed certain fundamentals of Christian teachings within it. And one of them was this understanding that mission to the world is one of the commandments that God had given the church. And therefore, Nostra Aetate has in it various sentences that when I mark up the text, I mark them up in red as things that, had they been developed in actual Christian implementation of Nostra Aetate, Jews would have found quite problematic. And the major motivation between such things is this question of mission, that the world needs to become Christian. So in the 1974 guidelines, it admits the church must preach Jesus Christ to the world. It's coming from Ad Gentes, which is another document of the Second Vatican Council. So it has authority, that has absolute authority. But what does it mean? So lest the witness of Catholics to Jesus Christ should give offense to Jews, they must take care to live and spread their Christian faith while maintaining the strictest respect for religious liberty, in line with the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, Declaration Dignitatis Humanae. So that's a second document of the Council, which respects religious liberty of others. They will likewise strive to understand the difficulties which arise for the Jewish soul, rightly imbued with an extremely high pure notion of the divine transcendence, when faced with the mystery of the incarnate Word. So Christians have to strive to understand the challenge that mission causes for Jews. So all of these challenges have been addressed over the past 55 years, at least to the point that Christians struggle with them. Why? Because we have dialogic relationships that are built up in good times. We have camaraderie that allows us to confront more difficult discussions too, to speak our hearts. So in the most recent comprehensive statement, which came out for the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, so this is a statement that came out 5 years ago last month. The document was notable in that Jews were involved in the process of drafting, not so much in writing it, but in responding to the drafts, and also in the promulgation. So you see here the official announcement of the document with Cardinal Kurt Koch on the right and Rabbi David Rosen of the American Jewish Committee, one of the major players in international Jewish-Christian relations, on the left. And so this rather lengthy document summarizes the paths taken over the previous 50 years, and it lays out the issues that are still being worked through. And it points out that, just to summarize, the document is about 50 pages long, so I'm going to summarize it in about 50 seconds, that some things are very easy. Things like working together for social justice issues, or confronting poverty together, environmental concerns. And if you see a overlap with Biden's agenda right now, that's because Biden is also interested in this liberal Catholic agenda. Addressing racism, I should have added. Even we can join together on civic celebrations easily. We can also come together over joint study of shared texts or values in order to learn about each other. And those are all things that have been achieved and that are good and that need to continue, because each generation needs to be involved in them too. Some of the issues, though, are more difficult or challenging. Some of them are because of Christian theological demands. So the question of what is covenant and mission, I'm going to return to those two because I think they're particularly important. But we also have questions around issues of medical ethics, particularly issues around the beginning and end of life, where Catholics and particularly liberal Jews are not seeing themselves in the same place. But if we understand the values lying behind it, maybe we have more grounds for discussion. So, covenant. In Nostra Aetate, it said, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. And Pope Francis, the current Pope, in a apostolic exhortation in 2013 called Evangelii Gaudium, called in English On the Proclamation of the Gospel in Today's World, he wrote, "We hold the Jewish people in special regard because their covenant with God has never been revoked. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. And also that God continues to work among the people of the old covenant." Before Nostra Aetate, this would never have been said. Before then, the Christian covenant with God superseded, took the place of the Jewish covenant with God. And so this is an acknowledgement that Jews have a place in the way that God structures the world. And that is particularly important. And so the question, though, still is, and is still being worked out, is what exactly it means for Catholics to recognize God's covenant with the Jews. And this is actually complicated from the Christian side, much more so than it is from the Jewish side. Because I think that Judaism, in my understanding, quite easily says, well, because we are a people, and God is in covenant with a people, Judaism is making a global, universal claim about the extent of God's relationship with the Jews. Therefore, God can be in covenant with other people in other ways, and maybe that's what God intended. That's essentially, Maimonides wrote that in the 12th century. That God had purpose in creating Christianity, in creating Islam, in bringing people into relationship with God. But Christianity and Islam also make universal claims. And this makes it very, very complicated for them to admit to God having multiple covenants with the world. God is true to God's covenants because otherwise we have no security about our relationship with God today. But how do we fit in changes in that covenant, emergence, evolution in that covenant, and diversity within that covenant is something that is still very, very complicated from a Christian point of view. For Jews, it's maybe not as important as it is for Christians, but it's extremely important for Christians because this involves claims of salvation. Now, Judaism focuses much less on salvation as a driving category of what matters to us. But if Christianity's universal vision needs to work this through, and our Christian colleagues need our help in getting to the end of it. Briefly, I want to also talk a little bit about mission. So in the 1960s, and for many today, this is a mitzvah of Christianity. And so it's one that had, so this is the language from Nostra Aetate itself, that the church needs to proclaim the cross of Christ as the sign of God's all-embracing love and as the fountain from which every grace flows. And I put on the slide also here the quote from Matthew that is the basis for this. It's something that the church can't get around, but it's something which is very much part of the history of the church. I have a map here of the ghetto in Rome in 1676, and you can see at each of the gates that are circled, right outside the gate, there were churches. And you can still see two of those churches today. I have pictures of them on either corner there. And the one that I had on the right still stands very clearly and has an inscription on it. This is standing right behind the main synagogue in Rome, which was built after the ghetto walls came down. But it says on that inscription, I held out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices, a people who provoke me to my face continually. And this is what Jews saw in, you can't see it very well in the picture, but in Hebrew and in Latin, the minute they walked out that gate from the ghetto. So one solution to this image that Christians must try to get Jews to become Christians, has been to redefine Christian evangelism as a model that seeks to show to the world what it means to be a good Christian and to make Christianity a competitor on the world market because it's attractive. And so you see this in something that I took from a Twitter page from Pope Francis's Twitter account, not just now, a while ago. But he says the gospel calls us to be close to the poor and forgotten and to give them real hope. That's contemporary evangelism. And that's unobjectionable, to help people who are poor and forgotten to have hope. And that's a very different model. So there are other dialogue topics that are complex for other reasons. I want to name one more, which is literally the elephant in the room. And this is the discussion of Israel. Since the process of Nostra Aetate, Jews have been telling their Christian dialogue partners that understanding the concept of Jewish peoplehood and its ties to the land of Israel is too central to Judaism to be ignored. At the same time, the topic is enormously fraught because the lack of peaceful relations between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as the wider Arab neighbors. Mainline churches today resist Jewish calls to partisanship, though some listen to Palestinian Christian calls that sound partisan to Jewish ears. And then there is the evangelical pull in a different direction, especially on the Republican Party, that is pulling to support for Israel because of evangelical understandings of fulfillment of biblical prophecies, and the progressive pull that's seeking solutions to suffering and injustice, which is favoring Palestinians and ignoring Israeli concerns. So Mark mentioned at the beginning the new book, which came out just a couple months ago, of which I'm a co-editor, called Enabling Dialogue About the Land. We're in a situation where Jews and Christians have just simply not been able to talk about these issues of Israel and Palestine. And we are seeking through this book to provide some materials both for study and then also for adult education dialogues, where we have materials providing texts from a whole range of different viewpoints, from the right to the left, Jewish, Palestinian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim to a certain extent, with some tools to help people figure out how to listen to each other. And just to begin the process of dialogue and understanding by trying to understand, to put oneself in the other's shoes for a moment and understand why they are saying what they are saying. So this is an extraordinarily complex process, and one that will take quite a while to gain fruit, but on the other hand, it takes some passion and some courage to dive into it and to become part of this discussion. So where are we? We've come a long way from the Roman ghetto, from the Holocaust, but undoing almost 2,000 years of negative thinking about one another, of hatred and distrust, while maintaining our own integrity as distinct religious communities, is not something that can be achieved instantaneously. The deeper we go, the more complex it becomes. And still, each generation must remember the history and continue to participate in the process, or we will revert. We see reversions in this past month's news. Only coming together in dialogue, only getting to know one another as living, breathing, loving human beings across our differences, all things that are challenged by our pandemic reality, can keep things moving forward. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and conversation with you.
Mark, do you have any, would you like to moderate, Mark? That was great. That was great.
You want me to moderate?
Well, I don't know if you can see everybody and actually there are some hands up, so.
I can certainly call on people, absolutely. I know Fred Davis already had a question. I don't know if you saw it, Dr. Langer. That was,
I've just pulled it up just now.
yeah.
Rabbi Zub has a question too. He had his hand up.
Yeah, so let me start with Fred since he put this in the chat, and I invited questions in the chat. So the questions are about kids today. Is your course mandatory at BC? I have a undergraduate core course, which is one version of the core. The students have to take a semester, which is either a course on Bible or a course on interreligious dialogue, Christianity and. So I do a semester on Christianity and Judaism. It used to be a 2-semester course. I mourned for that second semester, but it is what it is. And then I do other courses. I did a more in-depth course on Jewish-Christian relations last semester. At the moment, because I'm directing the center, I'm only teaching one course, 3 courses a year. So I have, and 2 of them this year were the core course, the undergraduate core course. So how do your current students relate to these 20th century developments? And I think that they see it as relevant when I do a unit on ecology. And for instance, Pope Francis has a very, very important document on ecological justice. So we do that, and then we come up with some Jewish equivalents and compare. I did a unit this year, I'm doing a unit this year on racial justice, which is challenging to come up with something that's really substantive on the Jewish side especially, but very, very important. So I always bring it home. I've done things on reproductive ethics, where the whole question about abortion becomes important. I've done discussions on marriage when the students perk up when you come to issues of divorce. So those sorts of things, yeah, that sort of understanding. Do I bring up mission and covenant with them only in passing in the undergraduate core class? That's more complicated stuff, but more important stuff too.
Great. Thank you. Rabbi Zub, you might want to unmute.
Dr. Langer, welcome. You came as a scholar in residence many years ago.
It was quite a while ago. I don't remember what year it was. Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
To what extent has an effort been made to help Catholic priests in the pulpits get educated about these things? Has the church really taken it seriously to try to, because I think that was a major source of anti-Semitism, the ignorance of sometimes the Catholic clergy preaching at Easter or other times about deicide or other things.
Right. So this is a huge issue. In theory, it's part of seminary education. In reality, it's less strong than it should be, and that's one of the issues on my personal agenda, is to see what we can do, at least locally, because BC has a seminary, to bring this into the seminary agenda. It's not just clergy actually in the Catholic world, because increasingly people who are doing things clergy used to do, there are just not enough men who want to become priests. And so there are a lot of the clerical type tasks, pastoral tasks of, visiting the sick, just about everything, education, that are actually in the hands of lay people these days in the American Catholic Church. So this is something which it ebbs and flows, and it needs to be brought back into the flow chart, as far as I'm concerned, and it's something which is important. I'm just making a note of that because I have a meeting with the dean tomorrow, and I have to have my ideas together. Yeah, there are a couple other questions in the chat too.
Mark Beal asked in the chat about how does the Jewish, how does the Jewish particularism complicate relations with Christians?
Do you want to explain better what you mean by particularism?
Yeah, he actually had two before that. He had does feminism complicate.
Right, that I understand. That particularism, just to explain what you mean by, Mark, what you mean by particularism, that would help.
I can't read your mind yet.
Yeah.
Chosen, we're the chosen people.
Okay. So chosenness. Chosenness is something that Jews have a lot of problems with. Yeah. I mean, how do we understand that concept? And there's lots of answers, but I personally like the understanding that it's a chosenness for responsibility rather than a chosenness for specialness. The other piece of that, which becomes quite problematic, is when non-Jews understand that as a chosenness to exceptionalism, meaning that Jews, and in many cases Israel, have to be perfect. You know, that we can't make the same kind of errors and mistakes that other peoples make. And so that's a question that requires an honest discussion of, well, does this line in Exodus 19 mean that I or my community are superhuman? And the answer to that, obviously from our perspective, is no. We have certain ideals that we strive for, but we aren't superhumans. So I think that is an important piece of an answer to that. Feminism is less of a problem on the American scene because it's certainly at Boston College, where the Catholic community is not the conservative Catholic community, that feminism is considered is something where the church, my colleagues feel that the church's conservatism about the roles of women is limiting them, and they are not very supportive of it. So Boston College loves that they can call me rabbi. You know, that they can have women clergy on the theology faculty is for them a plus. And so that's not a problem. And that's not a problem in the dialogue world, with the exception of the fact that the leaders on everything Catholic, especially when the leadership is coming from the hierarchy, is going to be men. And so I've been at meetings where there's 2 women and 9 men in the room. And boy, are we close to the 2 women, because we're just such a minority in these cases. I've grown up in a situation of just not being worried about that particularly, but it is a reality that women are blocked at a certain level of taking on leadership roles. And it's harder to get in. They're not going to think initially of a category that includes me when pulling together people on a meeting. So it is a bit of an issue, but I think not the overarching issue. So
thank you. Also on the chat, just going in order, Elizabeth, do you want to explain a little bit more? You have a question on racial justice and how that may be complicated by, combining that, I guess, with Judaism. I don't know if I'm asking your question correctly.
Oh, I think she's responding to a statement that I made, that it's a little bit more complicated. I have had troubles thinking on racial justice that goes beyond the superficial. on the Jewish side. So there's lots of materials on racial justice, particularly from the Reform Movement, from the Religious Action Center, from the URJ. And it's yes, we agree, we approve, we applaud issues of racial justice. We want to try to make them part of our lives and part of our thinking, and we want to address where we're not thinking as broadly and as productively as we could be. But it's not pulling out sources. It's not interrogating things philosophically and theologically, which is, in my context and the kind of teaching that I'm doing, I want to show my students how would Jews approach this sort of issue from something deeper than just gut level. All right, the gut level's in the right place, but how do we actually teach and learn about this? And that's actually very much more complicated. So I ended up landing on a article by a rabbi named Aryeh Bernstein, who works for a group called Avodah, which is a very liberal, but within the observant world, I think taking tradition seriously, organization that's devoted to training people to do social justice work. And he did an article, came out, I think about 2 years ago at this point, on a Jewish argument for reparations, in which he looked at things that came up actually in this last week's Torah reading, that the Jews had to, was it right for the Jews to go to the Egyptians and say, give us your silver and your gold, and we're going to take we're going to take this out of Egypt with us? Was that right, or was that straight out stealing, or was it reparations for all those years of slavery? And he examines the sources looking at that, and then applies that to the Black Lives Matter argument that the descendants of slaves in the United States never received reparations for their years of slavery. So I'm looking for sources, I'm looking for discussions at that sort of intellectual level to say, what is it that Judaism can bring to this conversation that goes beyond goodwill?
Dr. Langer, could you post somehow or just give us that reference to that article?
It's called The Jewish Case for Reparations. Okay. And it's by Aryeh Bernstein, Bernstein. And I can get you the link. If you can't find it, I can get it for you. It's online.
Thank you. As you can see, there's a few more questions there. We've got, just to get someone new, and we've got one from Michael here. Michael, do you want to ask it yourself? Michael Breyer, or you have to unmute. Your question here about almost everything you've said places Christians and non-Christians in positions of blaming Jews. Does this mean that Christians have much more work than Jews to do? Is this true? And if this is true, how will they do it?
Okay, so that's a very, very important question.
Okay.
And in many ways, my previous book from 2012 is an attempt to dig into exactly this kind of question. So yes, in many ways, Christians have anti-Judaism embedded in their authoritative texts from the New Testament on. Once it's in the New Testament, then decoding and getting rid of it is a big, big challenge. It's possible, but it requires learning to read the Bible itself with a non-literal lens, and to understand it as something which has a human level, which comes from the historical situation in which the text was written, and decoding the rhetoric from the first century. And that then, plus the inherited instincts. If I ask my students what they learned in school and what they learned from their grandmothers or grandfathers, what they learned within the family is where the poison continues. So it's a huge, huge challenge to address the anti-Judaism and the prejudice that we all learn certain prejudices. Certainly my generation, people older, we've tried to confront prejudices that we grew up with that were racial prejudices. Our world has shifted around issues of LGBT and the extended initials on that list. When I was a child, that wasn't something that I had a category for in my mind, or it was other, and it's normal now. So we've changed, and this is something which is really complicated. I see you, Michael. Let me just finish my thought.
Sure.
So to the other part of your question, though, is do Jews have any of this? Do Jews have work to do? And the answer is that Jews were the suffering minority in Christian society for much of Jewish history, especially for European Jews. And so we have instincts, we have language that we've inherited, we have concepts that we've inherited that we also need to be interrogating. They're not embedded in our scripture. And that makes it easier to deal with if we name them and confront them. And others of our traditions and texts were censored by the church. So that's what this whole book is about that I wrote, is a prayer that was an anti-Christian prayer in its origins, but it was censored by the church and it lost its anti-Christian edge. Not a prayer that Reformed Jews are terribly familiar with, but so this is,
We're about to jump.
there are points where Jews have had to confront this, but in some cases, the texts were ripped away from us or literally scribbled out, and we had to adapt over time in history. So Michael, you wanted to follow up, or did I finish?
Yes, thank you for that, the explanation. I'm really worried about the present and the future. You know, what part do the Jews and the Christians play? I like what you said about the meetings that we have, you know, for understanding. But you know, I just worry about all the people out there, all the non-Jews and Jews, you know, and about communicating, about sharing. And you know, I don't see it happening enough to eliminate this problem. Maybe I'm being naive.
You know, I think all we can do is try, all we can do is educate, all we can do is make our voices heard within our communities. Look at how people are being educated. Look how we're educating our own children. Be in dialogue, in coalition with people who are educating children within other communities, and make friendships. Make friendships, because once you have a friend and you know somebody, you're not going to tolerate, and well, I say maybe the way to frame this is a little bit different. Don't tolerate ideas that are destructive, divisive, demeaning of others, either about ourselves, but even more so about the others.
Great. Cynthia has a question. Cynthia, I just need to unmute.
I just wanted to speak to that point because we are all here and we are involved in this discussion. How many people, Jews or Christians, are involved with their churches or synagogues in this kind of dialogue? Not many. And it is important on an individual basis to like a pebble in a stream to make that circle of knowledge, of understanding greater, so that we do little by little try to dislodge this kind of almost innate, with mother's milk that we take in, of fear of the other.
That's why I'm here. And that's why I do what I do. And I think, you know, feel that it's important to be doing it. So, it has to be little steps, but also I'm in a position because I'm educating people and writing and publishing. But I edit a journal also on Jewish-Christian relations to be pushing this forward at different levels and to be helping people to be involved. But yes, thank you.
And her husband, Harvey, also a past president. And then Marilyn, Michael's wife, they have comments to make. So we have some spousal recognition, starting with Harvey under the name of Jacob, the grandson.
Yeah. Okay. My question, Cynthia, are you muted? Cynthia, mute.
I thought I was. Can't get up there.
No. Okay, thank you. My thing is, a lot of anti-Semitism comes down to jealousy in a way, because the Jews have been urbanized, and because they're urbanized, in many ways they are better educated than the rural community. And what happens is, just a few years ago, I read something to the effect that the income difference between blacks and whites was the same as between whites and Jews. So that in many ways, the Jews tend to be living a better life than the average. And I think there is a certain amount of jealousy in here.
Yeah, no, I think that can be right. And when we talk about this at home, we also talk about the reality that the emphasis on education in the Jewish world has been extremely important, and is something that others could emulate in some ways, but also that we're not, the other thing that is that we're not a community that fears doing well. Christianity has embedded in it a value on poverty, which is not necessarily being poor and starving and hunger, but it is a value on, it doesn't, we have a much stronger sense that it's important to do well. It's important to do well in order to be able to help others. And so that whole discussion about wealth is an area where there is room for dialogue and for comparing and figuring out how these values actually ultimately intersect in care for others. But in order for me to be able to care for others, I also have to be able to care for myself. And so that becomes important in the Jewish world.
Thank you. I just want to get to another better half, Marilyn, and then another better half, Barbara down there as well. I see you, Barbara. So Marilyn.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I was very impressed by the picture you showed in the very beginning on your PowerPoint of Jews depicted as devils. I had heard this in talking, like growing up, but it actually happened to me when I was an undergraduate years ago. I had a really good friend who was from North Carolina. And when she heard that I was Jewish, we were really good friends that summer. We were both working at a resort in New York. And when she heard that I was Jewish, her immediate reaction was, how come you don't have horns? I thought Jews had horns, and it was astounding to me. And then in the same breath, she also said, at the end of the summer, we can no longer be friends because my parents don't allow me to be friends with Jewish people.
Wow. If you don't mind me interjecting, Marilyn, in my freshman year in college, I met a young woman from North Carolina in a mixer, and she asked me where my tail was. So maybe they're related. And by the way, she was very nice. She wasn't being obnoxious or anything. She had never met a Jew, and she had been told that they had tails.
It was the same woman Marilyn knew.
That's saying I think we met somebody from the same family.
I suspect there's more than one woman who had that issue. So yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent this is continuing to be an issue. It may be that that media and television and movies and things like that, the prominence of Jews in being depicted in those settings may have shifted some things in terms of that particular stereotype. But certainly the demonization of Jews without the physical imagery is still very much present.
Right.
And so that is a part of the question. The other thing that I saw somebody asked on the chat, Mark Beal, does intermarriage enter into discussion of Jewish-Christian relations? And the answer is necessarily yes, because the very fact that there is intermarriage speaks to the reduction in exactly these kinds of stereotypes of Jews. It also means that there are so many prominent people in the world who have Jewish family members. We can begin with the president and the vice president right now. We can begin with the ex-president or the former president. So the very fact that these folks know Jews opens up some very positive doors to lack of demonization and to maybe some level of understanding. I'm not always certain that works through. Personally, I'm not somebody who's excited by intermarriage, and I don't think that that's a solution, because it blends and it diminishes the otherness, which is, you can't have a dialogue unless you're others. You need to have things in ways in which you are different from each other, and you have to be proud and involved in that differentness and deepening it in order to then build bridges across it. And that's what dialogue is about. Dialogue is not about the Christmas tree with a Hanukkah menorah under it. Or
Right.
something like that.
Right.
So,
Barbara, I just unmute.
you're muted.
You're still muted, Barbara. If you have real problems, the space bar sometimes works if you hold it down. Maybe hold down the space bar. That might help you. I know that Hank has trouble with it sometimes. No?
You can unmute or mark.
I cannot unmute. No, the host cannot unmute.
You can only ask to unmute.
Unmute. Barbara, when you get there, just tell us and we'll come right. Oh, there you go.
Okay. I wondered about the other churches, like the evangelicals, Protestants, etc. The differences. Are there similarities or great differences that you take into account when teaching your classes?
Yeah. Okay. So I have the advantage and maybe the disadvantage of teaching in a Catholic context. Not that all my students are Catholics by any means. So I'm involved in a bunch of different dialogues, obviously most intensively with Catholics, partly because they're the most organized about it too. But I'm involved in a Jewish evangelical dialogue. But that's with a very specific slice of evangelicals, the sort of liberal evangelicals. There are also the evangelicals who are very involved in Israel issues, but that's for some of them because they think that the state of Israel and Jews have to be back in Israel is a necessary step before Jesus will come again. And so it's very much for part of the evangelical own agenda and not because they're interested in the well-being of Jews. So I'm personally not involved in that. It's very complicated. If anybody could ever map out all the different Protestant denominations in this world, they deserve a Nobel Prize. It's almost more complicated. It's much more complicated even than mapping out the Jewish map. But so just as we have a lot of diversity in the Jewish world, there is even more diversity, especially in the Protestant world, but even in the Orthodox Christian and Catholic worlds, there's diversity. So we have to be very cognizant of that, and it makes your question very important.
Right.
And with each group, there's going to be different dimensions of dialogue.
Right.
So the Lutherans have done, some Lutherans, not all Lutherans, but the ECLA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, ELCA, and the German Lutherans have done very, very important work in dialogue and trying to confront the problematics raised by their founder, by Martin Luther, who was a rabidly anti-Jewish, destructively anti-Jewish. He called for burning down synagogues, things that only Hitler managed to do.
Right.
And so these folks have really confronted that piece of their heritage and worked with it. But other Lutheran synods haven't touched that and don't and won't. Same thing, American Baptists versus Southern Baptists. Again, very different in terms of their openness to dialogue, in their willingness to even think about what this whole question of mission means to Jews, because mission is very central to them.
Great. Thank you. Oh, Barbara, you want to have some more? Yeah.
Just what advice do you give then to Jews in talking, that we shouldn't paint everyone with the same brush or make responses or questions without knowing what we're talking about with
I think it's very important to make relationships with specific people and specific communities. So if your synagogue were to be in dialogue with a local church, for instance, learn about that church's own teachings and how it works and how it functions.
Right.
So I know that Temple Shalom in Newton for a long time had relations with the UCC church. I don't know what's happened since the rabbis have shifted over.
Whoops.
That requires a certain element of engagement with what the UCC is involved in directly. The Catholic Church fell apart in Boston over the sex abuse scandal, and we're talking 20 years ago now. But we were on the verge of putting together a big program that was going to bring parishes and synagogues together in dialogue. And then the Catholic Church had to turn its energies correctly elsewhere to bigger problems.
Right. Let me highlight, and Fred has his hand up. Will, I see your hand up too. I'll get to you next. Fred, you also had a comment earlier about or a question we didn't address about the younger people. And I think that's an important point given the age of who is on this particular Zoom call, and your point about Dr. Langer being in touch with a lot of people in their 20s and 30s, a lot of our children or grandchildren's age. So shoot, Fred.
Right. Okay. And picking up from that, maybe I can also pick up from what, Mike, you were asking, because it goes along with that. I guess what I'm wondering is, we're talking about organized religion, and I'm guessing that the next generation is less organized or less devout, or will be. They seem to be less connected, perhaps, and maybe not, but they'll connect in different ways in their generation. And I wonder if at least organized religion, all organized religion can and is saying strongly enough, rejecting strongly enough, real hate and real treason and real big lie, white supremacy and anti-Semitism. I would think all organized religion can at least come out with strong statements and programs and educations, etc., to reject these aspects that all depend on, a promulgation, an ongoing promulgation of one or another aspects of the big lie.
Yeah, it's a big challenge though, because I mean, there are various statements that have come out, but a statement has to be more than just a statement, because if it's just words on paper or words on a screen, unless something is done around that statement. So, I mean, in the last month, there have been statements that have come out from the CCAR and the URJ's leadership, there, and from the Catholic bishops and various other contexts. But how do we generate a civic response for this? On the one hand. On the other hand, there's a challenge within an individual congregation. The congregation I'm a member of has some people who have voted Republican. And my friends were not in that group. And so we've been having free discussions for 4 or 5 years now. And we don't know, we're not quite sure what we're going to talk about now. But given a congregation that's dues-based can't alienate its members. So how do you have that conversation
Right.
in a way
I
that
guess
leaves
what I'm
room
getting
for
at is,
political disagreement within the community?
right, and I guess what I'm getting at is, cannot one excise the margins, and on the margins call them treasonous, hateful, white supremacist, violent? Those should all be, that shouldn't be a problem, Republican or Democrat.
I would hope so, but it is a political dance.
Hold on one second.
That's where history comes in, I think. And this last thing I'll say, sorry for cutting in, but fascism is fascism, whether it was 80 years ago or today. And nobody should be afraid to say that. That's my opinion.
And I think that message is coming out pretty loud and clear in the Jewish world that I've heard. Right. But I'm also, again, not part of the Jewish world that was voting for Trump.
Right. Let me get to Will. Will, I know you're struggling there technically. I hope it's okay.
No. I just want to make a statement for Dr. Langer and then have her comment. I mean, I'm not old enough to remember Father Coughlin preaching on the Boston Common, but growing up, I certainly remember hearing about it. And then I remember my father was somewhat friendly with Father Cardinal Cushing, and that he married the daughter of the person on Louis, had a connection to the Jewish community. And I saw things. So in my own life, I've certainly seen an improvement in Jewish Catholic relations. When I was president of the Temple in 1984, I was invited to have a luncheon with Cardinal Law when he became the cardinal. And I remember the very positive things he said about Jews. So I just wanted to, it's a hopeful note in a way. So I was just, if you could comment on Jewish Catholic relations in Boston.
Well, I mean, there's radical change. I mean, between Father Coughlin, but that no longer exists, and he was excommunicated, I believe, in the end. Certainly had his permission to teach removed. So did Father Feeney. There were some other figures locally of this sort. But the person who endowed the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College grew up in the Blue Hill Avenue, I guess that's Dorchester. And he said he's one of the people who, as a child, used to chase the Jewish kids on their way to school. And, he gave us millions of dollars in endowment as part of his way of saying, I'm sorry for this, which I grew up with. But that's not much of the reality of Jewish kids in Boston today. There's very, very little of it, and when it happens, it's addressed. So the world has changed radically since the Second Vatican Council. Another example, which was more disturbing, it's more in my memory, is when they went to name the Zakim Bridge. And if we remember, there was a debate whether it should be called the Bunker Hill Memorial Bridge or the Lenny Zakim Bridge. And most people wanted it to be Zakim, but there were people in bars in Charlestown, I guess it's pronounced correctly, who were saying, why should we be naming our bridge after that Jew? Or something to that effect. And at the end, there was a compromise. So it's technically the Lenny Zakin Bunker Hill Memorial Bridge. But what is it actually called? The Lenny, I believe, right?
Right.
So nobody remembers the second half of it.
Right. Right. Let me, as we're finishing up now, I get about 10 more minutes. Mark Beal asked a question a little while ago here on the chat, which I think is very interesting, which is just about you, Dr. Langer. When and, sort of why and how you got involved in, sort of Jewish-Christian relations. How did you decide to become so involved in it and make it your life's work?
Yes, that's actually pretty easy to answer. I just need to send a text because I have something at 11:30. I'm just going to tell them I'll be a bit late.
And if I can see hands while if there are any more questions, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So it is functionally, I mean, I took some classes as an undergraduate in Christianity, but that was part of taking classes in lots of other religions. I got a job at Boston College. My husband's at Brandeis. We had moved here when he got the job. I was still writing my dissertation, and I was hoping for something close to home. We live in Newton, and I actually have, I drive fewer miles than he does to get to work. When I'm driving. We're both remote this year. So getting a job at Boston College in a Catholic theology department, the question was, what do you do to make this work? And it was quite clear, it became quite clear pretty quickly that getting involved in Catholic Jewish relations was the direction to make this a position that could have some impact. It really, for me, fulfills my rabbi hat in my life as opposed to my professor hat, because I feel like I can make some changes in the world. And and I'm positioned in a way to be teaching graduate students. I teach PhD students who will go out and be the next generation of professors. I'm reaching undergraduates, some of whom are coming into the class because they have to, but that's all right. And that is something which has become a mission in my life, to use mission in a different way. But it fell into my lap in many ways. And it's a way to make teaching Judaism in a Catholic context be meaningful and effective.
Wonderful. Cynthia, who's on here. Cynthia, you've talked many times about you and Harv, your decision to move to Westwood with your family, even knowing it wasn't a Jewish neighborhood. It was more of a Christian neighborhood, and raising your children in that kind of setting and everything you've gotten out of that as well. I think Harvey wants to speak.
Yeah, I just want to make an observation. I grew up back in the 30s, and I can remember when you didn't go to the Cape because many places had Gentile clientele only, and Jews were not welcome there. And the big change after the Second World War, when everything became open, and it was not only the war, but it was the Holocaust that made the big change. Personally, I've gone from being a Jew to being called an old Yankee, and it's a real change.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I just said
what I was talking about when I was saying that Jews have become white, or we've striven to become white, and now we're sometimes questioning that, how that works.
Right. If there are no more questions, I leave it to you, Mark. He's not reading my texts. Hey, you're my boss. You say you got to read my texts.
No, I was just typing in. Are there any issues that you have to deal with that really frustrate you that you'd like to? I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know.
Maybe a way of putting it, I hope I'm not doing it, Mark, is like having myself been in a Christian school for many years of my life. What sort of the biggest challenges you face? There are big pluses, I think. But are there any big challenges you face in doing the kind of work you do at a Christian school?
Yeah, there's a technical term for it, code shifting, whereas there's certain ways that you can talk within one community and certain ways that you have to talk within another community to be effective. And I'm an outsider in the Catholic community. And I've spent 25 years trying to learn the manners. And my students still think I'm too critical. So that's a piece of it. But just having the instincts. I don't hardly drink at all. So I don't drink enough to fit in well. But then food, because I keep kosher, I'm different. Because I keep Shabbat, I'm different. So fitting in is something which is a constant tension, how to fit in and how to make that work and how to be appropriately different so they know what a Jew is and what a Jew stands for.
Wonderful.
So I have to, thank you so much for presenting a terrific discussion for us here of the whole gamut of issues that confront Jewish-Christian relations and being so what's the word, homey? I'm trying to think of it, just graceful about your answers and your approach. It's been really a great session. We've all enjoy it, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, and I hope to see you in person one of these days.
That would be great.
Yes, that would be nice.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Langer. That was wonderful. We really got a lot. We'll be talking about this for a while.
If you have questions, you know how to find me.
Great. Thanks very much.